Justin R. White asks, why do we now call it human trafficking instead of slavery? Could it be related to certain political groups wanting to portray slavery of blacks in America as unique in human history and thus preserve the benefits that perception yields? That's a really good point, Justin. I think that's probably a part of it. I think the reason that we talk about human trafficking is the same reason we talk about child abuse and or domestic abuse and child molestation, because human trafficking sounds a lot more civilized than slavery, and spousal abuse sounds better than wife beater, and molesting a child sounds better than raping a child or fondling a child. So on some level, it's part of the overall cultural constant cultural move to take away the meanings from words, to take away the power of words. And you can make a good case, I hadn't thought about this before, that this is one of the things that is in fact causing this entire society, the Western world, to be such a bunch of just mewing wimps, because all of the actual emotion is taken out of the language. That's certainly how they want to go. George Carlin did an absolutely brilliant section on this, and he talked about when World War I was going on and people were under heavy fire. Certain people, large number of people, it literally destroyed their nervous system. They think now that the actual concussive force actually destroyed their nervous system. But in any event, people were simply walking around, or they had blind, they couldn't see when there was nothing wrong with their eyes, or they had this terrible shaking or tic or whatever. Just crawled up in the corner. They're back in England in a hospital, and they're crawled up in the corner. And back in World War I, they called it shell shock. And as George Carlin points out, he says that's called it shell shock because that's what it was. It's a perfect name, shell shock. Powerful, explanatory, 2 letters. Great. He says by the time we get to World War II, we don't call it shell shock anymore. Now we call it combat fatigue. And combat fatigue is 4 syllables, and it's less instructive than shell shock is. It doesn't tell us so much about the situation, sounds a little cleaner and a little more manageable. And he says, and then finally when we get to today or Vietnam, we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, which is so homogenized a term, such a clinical term, that's the word I'm looking for, it's such a clinical term that it doesn't convey any of the power of it. If you had said that these guys coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, if you said they were suffering from shell shock, we'd treat them a whole lot more severely. I mean, when I say severely, I mean we treat them a whole lot more effectively than if we just say, oh, it's PTSD. We don't even say post-traumatic stress disorder anymore. Now it's just 4 letters that don't mean anything unless you know what it means. So we've gone from shell shock to PTSD, and it's just completely sanitized the whole thing, and written all of the things. And I hate to steal his line, but since I stole his whole routine here, Carlin closes that little segment. He says, this kind of thing just makes me want to vomit. Sorry, have an involuntary personal protein spill. And there you go. He sure could be right a couple times, that guy. He got pretty angry and bitter in his old age, but he was a brilliant observer. So that's a big part of it, Justin. But the other part of it is, you're right. Human trafficking is a modern problem. Slavery is the greatest evil of all time, and you don't want people mixing that up. I'd be actually very curious to just see what the genuine man on the street's reaction is. And I don't mean editing something together. There's this guy, I've forgotten his name, who goes out and interviews people about, what do you think about Hillary Clinton's plan to overturn the First Amendment, and people are always in favor of it because they don't know anything. They're the dumbest people in the world. He shoots it, I'm pretty sure, over at looks like he shoots it on Santa Monica Beach or Venice Beach, right down there. You can find some pretty scary stupid people there. But I would like to know what the average person on the street thinks about slavery. I would like them to explain the thing to me, because I think there'd be several misconceptions. Now, look, I'm just going to start here, and I'm going to have to say this, because if I don't say this, somebody's going to swoop in and take this whole thing take certain phrases that I'm going to utter out of context, and at least this way I have a marker down. slavery is evil, and slavery is the great evil in American history. It's the great stain on the honor and the fabric of the United States of America. It just was, and so let's just get that said. And let's also understand at the beginning that when we start talking about the slave trade and things like it, we're not excusing the slave trade, and we're not minimizing the effect that it had, and we're not trying to delegitimize it or make it any less evil than it was. But it bears talking about in practical terms. So if you're one of those people that are determined to hear me say that slavery wasn't bad, I'm not saying that, and slavery wasn't our fault. Not saying that either. But with all of that said, I don't think that these people who are part of Black Lives Matter are aware, and if they are aware, they're certainly not mentioning the fact that virtually all of the slaves that came from Africa, first of all, were caught by other blacks. White slave traders didn't go into the jungle with nets. They basically just sailed into one of these slave ports on the west coast of Africa, and they simply collected the slaves that other blacks had rounded up in Africa. So slavery was a white and black enterprise, and you couldn't have had it if it was just a white enterprise. You couldn't have had it if it was just white guys in the jungle thrashing around trying to catch slaves. Depended on the cooperation of black Africans to sell other black Africans to this foreign white race. That's number one. Number two, my understanding of these numbers are pretty close, that over the course of the 300 or 400 years of slavery from Africa by Europeans, that something like 11 million slaves were taken out of Africa over that length of time in total. And of that total, what percentage do you think went to southern plantations in the United States? I'll bet you anything, if you ask the common person on the street what percentage of slaves taken out of Africa came to the American South, large numbers of people would say 100%, and others would say 90%. But if I've got my data right, and it's been a while, my understanding was that 11 million African slaves were taken out of Africa, and 800,000 came to the United States. So that's what? It's 11%, maybe, something like that. 7-8%. It's most all of the slaves, 9 out of 10, went to the Caribbean, and we don't hear the stories about slavery in Honduras or in the Dominican Republic. You occasionally hear about the slave rebellion that liberated Haiti, but you don't hear that these plantations were taking 9 out of the 10 slaves out. It's all an American problem. It's America's fault with slavery. Well, those slaves that were going to the colonies in the Caribbean may not have been going to Great Britain and downtown London, but they certainly were going to places where the British were buying materials, and so was the rest of the world. The British, especially now, like to lord it over us how Americans are so incredibly uncivilized because they had slaves for as long as we did. Well, first of all, we didn't start out as Americans. We started out, most of us, as Englishmen. So the slavery came in with the Englishmen. That's number one. Number two, Britain's abolished slavery, I want to say 1846. And the U.S. abolished it in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, 65 or 66 with the 13th Amendment. So, yes, we're definitely 20 years behind the British on that, 20 years. However, the British Empire, the modern Britain, is traced back to the Norman invasion of 1066. So it took them 800 years to get rid of slaves, and it took us, about 80? Something like that? So that's a little more perspective on the whole thing. And by the way, there's a large number of Brits during the Civil War, were 100% on the side of the Union and 100% in favor of emancipation. The idea of the British going in on the side of the South, once Lincoln made it clear that he was going to make this a war about slavery. Once that happened, there was no way that the British were going to come in on the side of the South militarily. However, another one of these great unspoken truths is this. You have slaves on a plantation for a reason. And the reason you have slaves on a plantation is in order to collect a product. Because if you're not selling something that the slave produces, then the slave's nothing but net loss economically. And that's how these people treated other human beings, as economic assets or liabilities. So needless to say, if your slaves are not producing more revenue than feeding and housing the slaves takes, then there's no reason to have slaves. So the fact of the matter is there was tremendous revenue, and the revenue came from cotton. And the revenue from cotton came almost exclusively from Britain. So my ancestors were complicit in the slave trade to the degree that they were cotton carders and stuff working in textile mills in Lancashire. I know I have 3 or 4 generations of people living in essentially, one-room houses with no heating, working at a textile mill for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. But the point is, while everyone else can huff and puff about how morally superior they were, everybody was buying the cotton. They were either buying the cotton directly, as in the case of Great Britain, or they were buying the fabrics made from the cotton, which the British produced. So if there was no market for the cotton, then there wouldn't be any slave trade in America. So I think that kind of needs to be brought out. But I go to all this trouble, Justin, just to make one point. And that point is none of this matters. None of it. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because what matters is we don't have this issue of slavery. Slavery is not being brought up by Black Lives Matter when they assassinate people. Slavery is not brought up as a way of teaching us history. It's brought up as a justification. You hear this quite often. You see it all the street. And not forget these assaults on the policemen, these murderous assaults on policemen. A lot of times just common robberies or muggeries or the knockout game, all of that. They'll just say, that's for slavery. That's for 400 years of slavery. And off they go. This is the entire point. It doesn't matter how balanced or nuanced the slave trade was. It doesn't matter today. By the way, I should add one more thing, because this is an important point. My friend Jeremy Boyd pointed this out. Right now in America, and really since the Civil War in America, certainly, freedom and slavery is essentially binary, right? You're either free or you're imprisoned. You're either free or you're enslaved. However, at the time of up until the Civil War, there were gradations on freedom. There were people who were indebted to the landowners. I've forgotten the word of that. It flew right out of my head. Indentured servants, and there were apprentices who were voluntarily signing up to be with a master to learn the trade for 5 or 6 years, and their lives were certainly not free to come and go as they please. There was very little distinction, frankly, between people who were doing the housework. If you go, like, for instance, to Downton Abbey, right, and you look at Downton Abbey as an example of the British housekeeping system, that's right up until the 1920s and 30s. You say, well, what on earth would compel these people to be the servants of these folks and go through all the stuff that we saw in Downton Abbey and upstairs, downstairs, and all the rest? Why would anybody do it? What could compel somebody to take a job like that? And the answer is that the world outside was far, far worse than that. The world outside didn't have homeless shelters, they didn't have EBT cards, didn't have any of that stuff. You were either working in a house and had a bed to sleep in and a semi-heated room and 3 meals a day, or you're out on the street or starving out in the countryside. So that's why people took these jobs. But the point is, they are using slavery as a fig leaf, as moral cover to simply go out and commit whatever crimes they want to. Murder, burglary, rape. Why'd you do it? This is for slavery. Okay. Needless to say, this only country that's ever fought a war against slavery, against itself. This is the only country in the world that has ex-slaves living amongst their former masters in relative peace when you get right down to the numbers of people involved. And so what's really happening here is that it's simple, just street thugs. And the Black Lives Matter movement is designed specifically to legitimize the threat of violence. I think that's actually pretty succinct. Black Lives Matter is created in order to legitimize the threat and the actual implementation of violence. Black Lives Matter is essentially the SA. Everybody knows about the SS, which was the special Schutzstaffel Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, which started out as his personal bodyguard and became the people that administered the death camp. And these were the true believers, the SS. Hardly anybody talks about the SA. Prior to coming to power, I mean, Adolf Hitler started agitating in 1920, and he didn't become chancellor till 1933. So that's 13 years. And then they had a big purge in 34. But for that time, for the 14 years or so, the SA is what kept the Nazis in the game. And the reason they kept the Nazis in the game is because the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, would go to these meetings, and if somebody was hassling the speaker or Hitler, they'd simply knock him out and take him outside. And if there were communists speaking, they would go in there and break up those meetings, and they would bat people over the head, and they'd throw beer steins around, and sometimes they'd shoot people. And the SA was the private army of the National Socialists, and they were the muscle. Because Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels are not going to go out there and beat up communists. But somebody has to do it, right? Somebody has to beat up the communists. Somebody has to intimidate the guy that's running the printing press that's printing negative things about the National Socialists. So you've got a bunch of naturally violent people who look at this as saying, hey, I like fighting and I like to break things. Now I get to fight and break things in uniform, and not only do I not get punished for it, I actually get rewarded. I get rewarded. They didn't get rewarded by much money. They hardly ever got paid at all. But they got rewarded. They got to wear uniforms. They get some prestige. And Hitler talked about them and thanked them. And they felt like they were real men. So this is essentially the same thing as what Black Lives Matter is. And notice I'm not comparing them to the SS, because the SS murdered millions of people. And certainly Black Lives Matter has not done that. I'm not going to elevate Black Lives Matter, nor am I going to degrade the SS down to the level of Black Lives Matter. But we're not talking about the SS, we're talking about the SA. They're street muscle. And their purpose is to do things physically to intimidate other people that intellectuals would never do. They just never have the courage to do it. So again, Joseph Goebbels is what, 5 foot maybe? I think he was 5 foot. A bad leg, a crippled leg, tiny little man. And he and a bunch of others are cranking out all this propaganda against communists, primarily communists, before they got to power. They became the Jews afterwards. And he's not going to go into a beer hall and break up a communist meeting, but he can find a lot of people who will. And he's also not going to be able to stand in a beer hall and give his speech without protection. If it was just this little 5-foot man, then he'd start speaking, and in the times in Germany, in the interwar years in Germany, in a beer cellar, he'd simply be either beaten up, thrown out, or clubbed with beer mugs. So you needed some muscle for that. And this is essentially what they do. Now, we don't live in the same kind of physically coercive times that we did in the early part, or the first half of the 20th century. So not only is Black Lives Matter street muscle, they're moral street muscle. Definitely they go out there, and definitely they do things like block rallies and block freeways and make a lot of noise and protest and do all that other stuff. And that's important for their side. It has an impact. But what they really do is they give the Democrats the issue and the moral cover to make slavery an issue, to make race relations an issue, because if the Democrats do not get 80 to 90% of the black vote, they do not win the presidency, or under any circumstances. They have to get those kind of numbers, have to. And so in order to get those kind of numbers, this is why I think this whole thing is an indictable crime. In order to get those kind of numbers from black Americans, they have to constantly give them something to get up and vote for or against. So we heard Joe Biden saying, I don't know if it was 2012, I guess, the Republicans, speaking to a black group, Republicans want to put you back in chains. And, people believe this. They believe it. They believe a lot of things that you'd be quite surprised about out there. And so the Democrats, in order to survive as a party, the Democrats must consistently stir up racial divides, because they need black Americans to be feeling persecuted, and they need them to be in a state of fear and anxiety and emergency, because that is what will get them out to vote. And the percentage of votes that goes Democrat, what is it, 92%, something like that? They have to get them out. And experience shows that you cannot get them out unless you got, bloody shirt to wave. So when the problem with Black Lives Matter is it's a group of people whose entire argument is statistically false. Clearly statistically false. If we had a real epidemic of this, we'd be seeing these kind of things every day. And the fact that they make the news means that it's rare. Black on white murders don't make the news every day, and the president's not talking about them every day, and they're not doing specials on CNN on black on white murders and rapes, because it happens every day, many times a day. So the fact that they can isolate one or two cases means that they're an exception. This idea that black people are in danger in America by white people it's like everything else with these people. It's a complete, direct inversion of reality. It's the same as Barack Obama bringing in a budget with the biggest deficit in history of the country and saying this budget represents a path back to fiscal sanity. Huh? No, it doesn't. Well, I say it does. So you've got all of these dynamics working here. They've got all of these dynamics, but they really have crossed the line here. When the President of the United States invites the leaders of an organization into the White House, into the Oval Office, and tells them they're doing a great job, and then other people go out and murder in the name of Black Lives Matter, you've got a problem. The Democrats don't have a problem because this is exactly what they want. They want these tensions to continue to rise. As race relations have been set back at least 50 years in this country, maybe more, by the great healer, the light worker. So there is all of this stuff going, but none of this touches on the real issue. I just want to make sure I've got that coming up. Yes, I'll get to that when I get to the question. So anyway, Justin, I know we always kind of use these things as a launching platform, but human trafficking is a term used to separate modern slavery, which is committed almost exclusively by Muslims, from slavery. And slavery is being isolated to the American South as essentially the only issue of slavery. When the United States was founded, slavery was everywhere. The people that found Americans didn't just grow up out of the ground, The people that started America with those plantations were Europeans. And if Britain abolished slavery 20 years before we did, great. It took them 800 years. It took us 80. So all of this stuff adds a little perspective. But the point I was making before I went back and hammered some more nails in here is that none of this matters. White people could have been the only people to take slaves out of Africa, and they could have brought every single one of them over here. Both of those are just clearly false. And it wouldn't matter because I didn't do it and you didn't suffer for it. Now, they'll say, oh, hold on a minute, there's all kinds of privileges and so on and so forth that backed up in this. Every time I hear about white privilege, I go back to that Eddie Murphy sketch on Saturday Night Live where he goes around and tries to get a bank loan and all this other stuff. And then he gets made up as a white person. He's Mr. White. And then he goes back again. And, for example, he goes to the bank and he tries to get a loan as a black person. It's like, I'm terribly sorry, sir. Your credit is just not quite good enough. We see a lot of items here that we're a little concerned about. I'm afraid we're not going to be able to give you the loan. And so the joke is he goes and gets the white makeup on, and then he goes back to the bank, and they start popping corks of champagne, and they're literally throwing bags of money at the guy. And it's funny because it's a little overblown, but this is, I think, the perception of many black people have towards white privilege. I think they actually genuinely believe that we have a system where we keep black people down. And I keep wondering about this. Where's my check? And when are the meetings? Because I've been doing this for a while, and I haven't heard either of these things. I haven't gotten any paychecks to keep black people down, and I haven't heard anything about the meetings about keeping black people down. And no one sent me any emails about how we're going to keep black people down coming up in August of 2016. It's a gut level emotional thing. And what Barack Obama and the Democrats are doing is the most evil thing that you can do in this country. They're opening the deepest wound we have, specifically opening that wound that was just about healed, and poking around in there with dirty sticks to get it infected again. That's what they have to do in order to win. And so you're just in a god-awful situation. But if the President of the United States says we have to stop these assassinations of black people on the part of our police departments, and you're a black American, who are you going to believe? Are you going to go and research the statistics and what the statistics actually are? The President of the United States and the Attorney General said this is happening. It's not happening. There is something happening racially, and that is that white people are being murdered and raped and assaulted. I forget what the numbers are, but generally on average, I'll bet it's 20 to 1, 25 to 1. There is, in fact, a problem walking down a street in America between black and white people, and it's the inverse of what Black Lives Matter says it is. And I keep saying it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, because I didn't do it, and you didn't suffer for it. This is the slavery reparations argument pretty much in 20 seconds, right? We want reparations for slavery. Well, you were never a slave. Yeah, but my ancestors were. Yeah, but your dad wasn't, and his dad wasn't, and your great-great-grandfather wasn't, and your great-great-great-grandfather wasn't, and your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather wasn't, and your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a child when it was eliminated. So you get reparations for this. And my response would be, well, it seems like quite a long time ago for you to continue to carry this this trade. Now, I'd be completely in favor of reparations for actual slaves. I'd be 100% in favor of it. But these aren't slaves. These are 7 generations away from slaves. So let's say, well, it doesn't matter. The slavery has still happened, and we're entitled to the money, pony over the cash. My response then is kind of I like it a lot. When you run into people who say that, they say, look, even though it happened 150 years ago, it doesn't matter how far long ago it happened. It's still an injustice done by your people to our people, so pay up. My response to that would be, okay, if that's how we want to play it, let's play it that way. So we owe you for 400 years of slavery, but North Africans in the form of the Egyptians kept the Israelis, kept the Jewish people slaves for 1,000 years. Before we start writing you checks, every single black American needs to get the checkbook out and start writing checks to Jewish Americans to cover the slavery that black Africans held Jews in for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So everybody get out your checkbook out there, black America, and write reparations checks to the Israelis, or to the modern day Jews, I guess, American Jews, and also overseas Jews, to every Jew in the world, basically. Start writing checks to make up for the fact that your people held them in bondage 2,000 years ago. More. Then they'll say, well, that's ridiculous. Yes, it is. It absolutely is. It is ridiculous. And once you've got them there, that you've won the argument, because there's no set point on that time scale. 150 years ago, 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000, 5,000 years ago. No, it either happened to you or it's history. And it didn't happen to you. Now, I've said this before because it's pithy, and I think it's also fundamentally true. There is, in fact, when we're dealing with these race relations, there is, in fact, white privilege. And the best way to think of it is it's not so much white privilege as it's a lack of psychological training. See, this is the thing. These shackles, these emotional and philosophical shackles that some of these black Americans want money for, are self-inflicted. When I say that I benefit from white privilege, my white privilege is I don't get to blame anybody for my failures. That's it. That's the sum of it. My dad died. I got nothing. There's no inheritance from him at all. Zero. I didn't get a big start, and I'm not in any business that was built on the back of black people. The internet wasn't built on the back of American slaves. In fact, nothing was. That whole economy is gone, was destroyed in the war. So I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything to anybody. But my privilege is that I wasn't raised as a victim, and I wasn't raised to look for signs of organization where I failed. I failed. I made a mistake, or I stole something that I shouldn't have, or I started a business that didn't succeed, or I didn't get into the college I want. That's your failure, and you made that failure. It's yours. Now, if you want to say that was caused by white people, that's a convenient way to feel. Most people would rather feel angry and defensive than feel guilty and humiliated. And this is a way for them to transfer their sense of failure onto others. I'm trying to remember what it was. If you look at Neil deGrasse Tyson. It was our friend, I can't remember his name now because it's been banned from Twitter. Milo Yiannopoulos wrote a couple pieces about him and one about Bill Nye. And he basically shows the evidence that Neil deGrasse Tyson was essentially an affirmative action scientist. That they needed a face of science that was a black man. And if you look at his actual record and what he actually did, and his academic achievements, and his writing, and especially how he makes comments like just a couple weeks ago, he said, if you're in an airplane and the engine dies, you're in a glider. But if you're in a helicopter and the engine dies, you're an anvil. No, that's not true, Neil. Now, I don't expect you to know everything about aerodynamics, but you sure do talk like you know everything about everything. So what you end up with is you end up with this kind of dual sort of set of standards, and it reinforces the sense of inferiority. To the degree that there is prejudice against black people in this country, it's inflicted by Democrats and progressives. And the message they give to black America is, you're too violent and too stupid to succeed on your own, because if you aren't too stupid and too violent to succeed on your own, then you will go succeed on your own, and then you'll vote Republican, and we can't have that. So they basically say, we're going to give you special programs. We're going to give you special programs that allow you to get into college with a lower test score than white kids or Asian kids or Hispanic kids or anybody else. We're going to give you a special bar, and your bar is much lower than other people's bars. Everybody else has to jump over this high bar, but we're going to cut that distance down, and you just have to hop over the one we're going to make for you. See how much we love you? See how wonderful we are, this Democratic Party that was the party of slavery? Don't you understand how significant and subtle, but nevertheless how overwhelming a message that is to all black Americans? That we have special standards for you, lower standards for you in terms of getting into college? Am I the only person in the world who finds that deeply offensive on the part of and ashamed of my country? Forget about me. If somebody said, well, Bill, we've got a program here for conservative pundits, and we've got a special program that lets you into flying school for less money and so on. I'd be like, I don't need it and I don't want it. I don't need it or want it. I'm going to make it on my own or not. So that is that's basically it in a nutshell. It's once you understand that the Democratic Party requires a black vote plantation, once you get that understood, then everything else makes sense. All of it makes sense. Once you understand that the Democrats, in order to stay in power on a national level, have to get 80 or 90% of the black vote, and so they set up a vote plantation where they give them crappy phones, and they give them crappy transportation, crappy free housing, and crappy free food, and crappy EDP cards, and crappy this and crappy that, and all that the recipients have to do is work 2 hours every 2 years, go down to the polls and vote for more Democrats, you get more benefits. And by the way, the added benefit to you is you can pretty much do anything you want to, and we're going to write you a moral excuse for it. There must be millions of black Americans who are offended by this and simply just don't say it. They just must be offended by this. What does it say about a guy like Thomas Sowell? I don't know if Thomas Sowell's the smartest guy in the country, but he's the smartest guy I know of in the country. So what does it say if Thomas Sowell graduated from a university that had an affirmative action program? What would Thomas Sowell say? Hey, you're at a cocktail party. Where'd you go to? Oh, University of Mississippi. Oh, really? Yeah. So let's say he graduated first in his class, because I'm pretty damn sure he must have. He doesn't get that. He walks into the shadow of affirmative action. He could have succeeded on his own and did, but he goes to a place where there was affirmative action. So it's an unending series of connected things. But again, once you understand that the Democrats need an angry black population voting for them at the 90% level, then everything makes sense after that. And it's just absolutely pure evil. It's evil. That's not to say there's not prejudice. There wasn't prejudice in the country, and there still is prejudice in the country, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, because that's really the source of everything. So moving on here.